It was a cold grey morning in Paris, the kind of day where even the sky seemed undecided. Inside a grand diplomatic hall, the atmosphere was heavy not from the weather, but from what was about to unfold. European and African leaders had gathered for a high-level summit. The room was filled with polished shoes, hushed conversations, and the subtle tension that always comes when power meets resistance. At the center of the long marble table sat a man whose presence needed no announcement, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. Young, composed, and known across the continent for his unapologetic independence. He didn't dress to impress, but his eyes held something far more commanding: conviction. Beside him sat delegates from other African nations. Their expressions were tight-lipped, professional. But behind their still faces was a quiet concern. Today's meeting wasn't just about development or aid, it was about dignity. And they knew it. Then, on the other side of the room, French President Emmanuel Macron made his entrance. He walked in with the practiced ease of someone used to command his entourage trailing just a step behind. With a slight nod of acknowledgement, he moved toward his chair. As was customary, several leaders began to rise from their seats in a formal gesture of respect. And that's when it happened. Captain Traoré didn't move. He remained seated calm, still, his hands resting on the table, his gaze fixed ahead like nothing unusual was happening. But something deeply unusual was happening. Silence dropped over the room like a curtain. All eyes turned to him. Macron paused mid-step. Just for a second. His face barely changed, but the flicker in his eyes gave it away surprise. His aides glanced at each other nervously. Some African leaders averted their gaze. No one dared speak. Macron regained his composure and quietly took his seat. He adjusted some papers, pretending not to notice. But everyone had already noticed. Traoré remained a statue of composure. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than words. At the edge of the room, a journalist clicked her pen and scribbled something down. She sensed what many others did not fully grasp yet. This wasn't just a protocol breach. This was a message. Unspoken. Deliberate. And about to change the tone of everything that came next. The silence in the room stretched longer than anyone expected. It wasn't the kind of silence that simply falls between sentences, it was the kind that rearranges the atmosphere. You could hear the sound of someone shifting in their chair, the distant click of a pen, even the subtle hum of the ceiling lights. But no one spoke. Captain Ibrahim Traoré still hadn't moved. He sat perfectly still, as if rooted in something deeper than wood or marble, something historical. His posture was composed, but it wasn't passive. It was intentional. Defiant in the most disciplined way. President Macron, now seated across from him, stole a glance at the young Burkinabe leader. For a moment, their eyes met only briefly. But in that instant, something unspoken passed between them. A tension. A question. Maybe even a challenge. One of Macron's aides leaned in and whispered something close to his ear, perhaps urging him to address the moment or steer the meeting back on course. Macron shook his head slightly. Not now. It was a chess game. And the opening move had already been made. Some of the African delegates sat rigid, their eyes fixed on the table before them, avoiding contact. Others stared cautiously at Traoré, reading his body language. Was this personal, political, or something else entirely? Everyone in that room understood protocol. Standing for an arriving head of state wasn't just a courtesy, it was a script, repeated countless times. To break it was to speak without saying a word. And Traoré had broken it. Calmly and without apology. A French diplomat shifted uncomfortably and scribbled something into a notepad. Across the room, a South African delegate exhaled slowly, as if letting go of a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Macron, to his credit, didn't lash out. Instead, he reached for his glasses and placed them on the bridge of his nose. He looked down at the papers in front of him. "Well then," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "Let's begin." But everyone knew it had already begun. This wasn't about trade deals or development assistance. Not anymore. That quiet refusal to stand had tilted the room. It had unsettled the script. And now, every word that followed would be cast against the shadow of what had just happened and what it meant. The meeting had technically started, but no one was really paying attention to the agenda. The room, still unsettled from Traoré's silent act, buzzed with unspoken thoughts. Some pretended to review documents. Others glanced up, watching the two presidents like they were waiting for thunder after lightning. Then Macron did something few expected. He broke protocol again. Looking up from his notes, he leaned forward slightly and spoke in a calm but clear voice. "Mr. President," he said, addressing Traoré directly, "I assume there is a reason for your decision earlier. No anger, no sarcasm, just curiosity, but the kind of curiosity that carries weight." All heads turned toward the man in the dark jacket, and traditional shash the man who had remained seated while the rest of the world stood. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't hesitate. "Yes, Mr. President," he replied, his voice smooth but deliberate. "There is." And then he paused, not out of uncertainty, but to let the moment breathe. He looked across the table, not just at Macron, but at everyone gathered. "My stance," he continued, "is symbolic. I am not here to bow literally or figuratively. I am here to work as an equal. Burkina Faso is not beneath anyone, and our people deserve the same respect afforded to any other nation in this room." A hush fell over the room again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the table. But every word landed like a drumbeat. Some African leaders shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort but out of pride. A few exchanged quiet glances, nodding almost imperceptibly. This wasn't just a young president defending his position. It was a man speaking for millions whose voices had been sidelined for decades. Macron sat quietly, absorbing the words. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deflect. For a moment, it seemed even he understood that something more than diplomacy was happening here. Traoré wasn't performing. He was standing or rather sitting for something larger than himself. A South African journalist in the corner gently tapped record on her phone. She knew this clip wouldn't just go viral. It would become history. Because in a single paragraph, spoken with grace and steel, a line had been drawn. And the world was watching. For a few seconds after Traoré finished speaking, no one moved. No one blinked. His words still hung in the air, raw and unforgettable. Then, Emmanuel Macron leaned back in his chair. He exhaled slowly and adjusted his glasses once again, not out of habit this time, but to buy a moment to think. Because he knew every word he was about to say would echo far beyond the walls of that conference room. "I understand your point, Mr. President," Macron began, his voice carefully measured, "and I respect your conviction." The tone was polite, controlled, presidential, but also tense, like someone walking a tightrope between diplomacy and pride. "Still," he continued, "there are formalities, customs we all follow not for show, but to maintain the spirit of cooperation among equals. These protocols, in their own way, help hold the dialogue together." There was no applause, no agreement, just silence. Captain Traoré didn't flinch. He offered a faint smile, almost as if he had anticipated this exact answer. Then, he leaned forward, not aggressively, but with quiet certainty. "Formalities," he said slowly, "can have their place. I agree." He paused. "But when those formalities begin to overshadow the real purpose of why we gather to serve our people, then maybe it's time we examine who they truly serve." The room seemed to shift again, not in noise, but in gravity. "If these customs," Traoré continued, "were designed in an era that saw us as less than, then preserving them without reflection only delays the future we claim to be building." Across the table, A few African leaders lowered their eyes not in shame, but in silent acknowledgement. Others looked directly at Traoré, emboldened. A European delegate coughed gently, as if trying to cut the tension. But it was too late. The moment was alive now. For the first time, Macron's face softened not in defeat, but in recognition. There was no way to spin this. No way to outmaneuver sincerity this sharp. He looked down at his papers again, but now they seemed irrelevant. Then he looked up not just at Traoré, but at everyone. Something had shifted. Not because of anger, not because of defiance, but because one man had dared to sit still and speak the truth with grace. And for the first time that morning, some African leaders began to quietly, almost cautiously, applaud. The quiet applause rippled through the room like a breeze stirring a still lake. It wasn't loud, it wasn't planned, but it was real. President Macron turned his head slightly, as if surprised by the sound. Then he let out the faintest sigh not of frustration, but of acceptance. This wasn't a press conference. It was something more fragile, more human. He adjusted his posture, placed his pen on the table, and folded his hands. "Mr. President," Macron said, his tone shifting now lower, less rehearsed. "You are absolutely right." You could feel the tension begin to dissolve, molecule by molecule. "We may not agree on every method," Macron continued, "but we can agree on the goal results that actually improve lives. Real progress. Dignity that goes beyond symbolism." Traoré nodded slowly, his expression still calm but slightly softened. "I appreciate that," he replied, "because for us, symbolism isn't a luxury, it's survival. It's about rewriting the terms of engagement not just with other nations, but with our own past." Macron nodded once, not out of obligation, but something closer to understanding. "Then let's do that," he said. "Let's focus on real change. Let's begin." And just like that, the meeting finally found its footing. Documents were passed around. Points of negotiation were opened. But everyone in that room knew something irreversible had already taken place. The agenda hadn't changed, but the atmosphere had. There was a new kind of energy, new one, grounded not in formality, but in clarity, in honesty. Across the table, even the most guarded diplomats had relaxed slightly. The masks of protocol were still there, but thinner now, more transparent. The conversation began to flow, slower at first, then with growing ease. Topics like infrastructure, education, and sustainable development came into focus. But through it all, the unspoken remained. This meeting had already made history, not because of what was discussed, but because of how it began. Because one man sat still. Because one room chose to listen. And because, in a world where so many speak loudly to prove their worth, a quiet moment of conviction had stolen the show. News doesn't always travel fast. But this time, it moved like lightning. Before the meeting had even ended, a short video clip taken by a journalist in the room began to spread. Just 27 seconds long. No narration. No edits. Just a camera phone capturing the moment Captain Ibrahim Traoré refused to rise and the calm conviction in his voice as he explained why. Within hours, the internet exploded. On Twitter, the hashtag #resist trended worldwide. On TikTok, young Africans stitched together reactions, some teary-eyed, others with raised fists. On YouTube, analysts debated the meaning behind the moment. Was it rebellion? Was it pride? Was it the start of something bigger? In Burkina Faso, it was something else entirely. It was personal. By the next morning, the streets of Ouagadougou were alive with energy. University students marched with handmade signs. Respect is not requested. It is earned. Stand up, no stand tall. Traoré didn't move, and neither will we. Older generations watched from doorways and balconies, nodding with approval. For them, it wasn't just a political statement, it was a generational healing, a correction. A line finally drawn. In small towns and rural communities, radios buzzed with commentary. Elders gathered around village centers to talk about what had happened. Some called it the moment of dignity. Others called it the silent revolution. Everywhere, the same message echoed. Something had shifted. But not everyone agreed. On international media outlets, commentators were divided. A few described the gesture as a provocation, questioning if it would hurt diplomatic relations. Others called it bold, necessary, even historic. And in French media, the debate was even sharper. Some headlines accused Traoré of grandstanding, but others asked harder questions about colonial memory, respect, and how long formalities could be used to mask inequality. At the heart of it all was one undeniable fact. One man stayed seated. And somehow, that single act resonated louder than any speech or agreement ever could. It wasn't just what Traoré said, it was what people saw in him. Quiet courage, unshakable purpose, the embodiment of a continent tired of waiting to be seen. And while the summit carried on, the real story had already left the building. It was alive in the streets, in the songs, in the voices rising from classrooms, cafes, and dusty courtyards. It was no longer just about diplomacy. It was about dignity. A few days after the summit, Captain Ibrahim Traoré returned to Burkina Faso. But he didn't step off the plane into silence. He stepped into history. Crowds had gathered at the airport, waving flags, singing traditional songs, and holding hand-painted signs. Some read, "Thank you for standing your ground." Others simply said, "Dignity." But Traoré, as always, didn't seek the spotlight. Instead, he addressed the nation later that evening from the steps of the presidential palace. His tone was calm, measured, but his message, unmistakable. "I did not stay seated to insult President Macron," he began, "nor the people of France. That is not who we are." He paused, letting the air settle. "I stayed seated," he continued, "because history has taught us something. Too often, we were asked to rise not in partnership, but in submission. We were expected to play a role, not write our own." There was no anger in his voice-only truth. And across the country, people listened. Some on transistor radios in farming villages, others on smartphones in crowded cafes, still others watching from hospital waiting rooms, school corridors, and buses winding through red dust roads. "In that room," Traoré said, "I sat for those who have always been told to stand last, for the child in a remote village whose school has no roof, for the market woman who pays her taxes but still walks home in the dark, for every citizen who deserves to be treated not as a favor but as a fellow equal." The reaction was immediate. Radio hosts replayed the speech on loop. Teachers printed his words and pinned them to classroom walls. Artists painted murals with Traoré's silhouette beside phrases like, "We sat to rise." And something deeper began to form. Not protest, but pride. Not defiance, but direction. Across borders, African youth began quoting him in videos and essays. Some called it the dignity doctrine. Others simply referred to it as the sit that spoke. In the capital, a group of university students staged a peaceful demonstration, not shouting, not marching. They simply sat, in silence, for 30 minutes, holding small cardboard signs that read, "We sit with you." No slogans, no shouting, just presence. Because something powerful had been redefined. To sit still no longer meant to surrender. In Burkina Faso, it now meant, "We found our voice and we won't rise on command." The ripple effects didn't stop in Burkina Faso. Across the continent, Traoré's silent gesture became a conversation starter from government halls to college dorms, from family dinners to newsroom panels. In Nigeria, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu spoke at a regional economic forum. Midway through his speech, he paused, looked at the audience, and said, Captain Traoré reminded us of something we already knew but needed to hear again. Africa does not need to ask for respect. It deserves it. From day one, the audience erupted in applause. In South Africa, university students staged teach-ins under the banner, "Sit for something greater." Professors led discussions on post-colonial diplomacy. Suddenly, Traoré wasn't just a name, was a chapter in modern history being written in real time. Meanwhile, in France, the reaction was far more complicated. Supporters of President Macron took to media outlets, some accusing Traoré of theatrical defiance. He hijacked diplomacy for a headline. One pundit claimed, but not everyone agreed. A column in Le Monde went viral after it posed a bold question. Was Traoré's silence louder than our history? The author, a well-known French political analyst, wrote, "What Captain Traoré did was not a breach of etiquette. It was a mirror. A moment that forced France and much of Europe to look at itself with honesty. Colonialism may be gone on paper, but its echoes linger. And sometimes the silence of another forces us to hear what we've long ignored." That line alone was shared by millions. Inside the Élysée Palace, Macron faced pressure from both sides. Some urged him to condemn the moment more forcefully. Others asked him to lean in, to listen. Eventually, during a primetime interview, Macron was asked point-blank, "Do you feel disrespected by Traoré?" He looked down, gathered his thoughts, and said something no one quite expected. "I understand why he did it," Macron admitted. "And maybe it's time we reflect on how we've approached our African partnerships. Respect cannot be assumed. It must be earned and offered." The interviewer blinked, surprised. So was the public. Some praised his humility. Others criticized his softness. But the shift was undeniable. This wasn't just about one chair in one room. It was about legacy, memory, power, and the beginning of a broader, harder conversation the world could no longer postpone. Because one act of quiet courage had reignited a global reckoning. And everyone, now, was listening. Far from the halls of diplomacy and headlines, something quieter but no less powerful was taking shape. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had always said leadership wasn't about grand speeches, it was about action. And in the weeks following the Paris summit, he went back to doing exactly that, visiting villages, meeting families, listening more than he spoke. One afternoon, he arrived unannounced in a small rural community in the Sahel region. No press, no formal convoy, just a modest security detail and the dusty hum of a government truck. There, he met her, Fatou, a young woman in her late 20s, standing beneath a makeshift awning, surrounded by solar panels and scrap metal. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and had grease on her hands. But when she saw Traoré approaching, her face lit up not with surprise, but with pride. She walked over and extended her hand. "Welcome, Mr. President," she said with a smile. "Let me show you what we've built." Fatou was one of the beneficiaries of a government-funded solar empowerment program launched a year earlier. She didn't just receive panels, she received training, knowledge, and confidence. Now, she wasn't just powering her own home, she was teaching other women in the region how to build and install solar units from recycled parts. "I used to worry about feeding my kids," she said during a brief interview with a local reporter. "Now I'm teaching other mothers how to light their homes and power their futures. All because someone believed we deserved more than survival." Traoré stood beside her, visibly moved. He didn't need to speak. The camera captured his smile, the look in his eyes. The moment went viral not for its politics, but for its purity. Online, people began sharing Fatou's story with hashtags like #respect through action and #dignity is power. No speeches, no declarations, just one woman, one village, and a ripple of change. That afternoon, Traoré helped install a solar panel on a nearby roof. Not for show but because he wanted to. Locals gathered to watch, some in disbelief. "He's different," one elder whispered. He doesn't just speak about light, brings it. And in that moment, the narrative shifted again. From resistance to renewal. From symbolic to tangible. Because in the end, what Traoré stood for in Paris found its fullest meaning here in the hands of a mother named Fatou, building something brighter with what little she had. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou when the ceremony began. In the heart of the capital, a crowd gathered: farmers, students, teachers, children, elders, even international reporters who had followed the story from the moment Traoré stayed seated in Paris. They came not for spectacle, but for something deeper, to honor a feeling they hadn't been able to name for years. Hope, dignity, direction. Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked onto the stage in traditional Burkinabe attire. Simple and proud. No teleprompter. No entourage. Just him and his people. He looked out across the sea of faces, many of whom had lived through decades of uncertainty, many of whom, for the first time, felt seen. "We are not here tonight just to remember a gesture," he began, voice calm but steady. "We are here to celebrate what that gesture revealed, that we are no longer waiting to be invited into history. We are writing it ourselves." The crowd erupted into applause. He paused, letting the words breathe. "When I chose not to rise in that meeting room," he continued, "I wasn't rejecting a man or a country. I was rejecting a Minseta belief that some nations are born to lead, and others are born to follow." He looked toward a group of school children sitting in the front row, holding handmade flags. "Our dignity is not for sale. It is not conditional. It is not negotiable. And it does not need validation to exist." Tears ran down the cheeks of more than a few in the audience. Then, quietly, a young farmer named Suleiman stood. His voice shook, but didn't waver. "Mr. President," he said, "you didn't just stand up for us. You reminded us how to stand up for ourselves." The applause that followed was thunderous. As the ceremony neared its end, a little girl approached the stage. She carried a small wooden sculpture, two human figures holding hands. Etched into the base were the words, "Equality unites worlds." Traoré accepted it gently, kneeling to meet her eye. "How are you doing in school?" he asked with a soft smile. "I'm learning," she whispered. "And now, I can dream." He smiled. And in that moment, it became clear. The measure of leadership wasn't found in titles or treaties. It was found in the courage to sit still, the strength to listen, and the power to lift others with nothing but presence. And that would be remembered far beyond borders.